everyone. Good evening. I'm Martha Honey, and on behalf of Bard Lifetime Learning Institute, LLI, Bard College, and Oblong Books, I'm pleased to welcome you to this extraordinary event, a conversation with U.S. Congressman Jamie Raskin and about his new best-selling book, Unthinkable. In Unthinkable, Representative Raskin chronicles with honesty and insight the back-to-back tragedies of his son Tommy's suicide and the January 6th insurrection. Tonight's conversation will be guided by journalist Bill Press, host of the Bill Press podcast and a leading light in both the Washington, D.C. press corps and progressive Democratic politics. Now, as we begin, I want to tell you that during the course of today, we here working on this event have had a taste of what and how Capitol Hill really works. The House, including Congressman Raskin, are in the midst of an important, in fact, essential votes tonight, both on the budget and on Ukraine. And this must be completed before the evening is out. So Congressman Raskin may well be in and out of our discussion as he dips out to take a quick vote or two. The good news is that Congressman Raskin really wanted to do this event, and for that, we're very grateful. So when Congressman Raskin steps out for a few moments, Bill and I will carry on with Bill sharing some of his insights about Washington politics. On a personal note, I am fortunate to count both Representative Raskin and Bill Press as friends. Before moving to Rhinebeck 2 years ago, my husband and I lived in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Congressman Raskin was our wonderfully energetic and effective and always accessible representative. Even before his current prominence, Congressman Raskin was deeply loved and overwhelmingly re-elected by his Maryland constituents, to whom he is known simply as Jamie. And Bill Press, well, I've known Bill for some 30 years, from the time we first met in Costa Rica when, as fellow journalists, we were covering the war in Nicaragua. In my view, our country would be far better served if more members of Congress and the press were as principled, hardworking, and committed to our country's core democratic, small d, values as Congressman Raskin and commentator Bill Press. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping matters. The last 15 or so minutes will be for discussions, for Q&A with the audience. Here's how it will work. We've disabled chat and are using the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A module, and Bill will ask Congressman Raskin as many as possible before we close at 8 p.m. And now it's my privilege to turn the program over to Bill Press for his conversation with Congressman Jamie Raskin.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you. It's good to be with you. Congressman, good evening to you too. And I'm sure, Congressman, you and I share the view that when Martha and Tony left Tacoma Park, it was a big loss for the Washington area, for all of us. But our loss is the gain for the Upper Hudson Valley. So you people are very lucky to have Martha and Tony there. Congressman, it's good to join you again. Before we get into what you write about in this incredible book, Unthinkable, and your thoughts on where we go from here, I have to, as a journalist, ask you about the tragic news of the day in Ukraine. What is your sense of the situation today in Ukraine, and are we doing enough as Americans to help them out?
Well, first, thank you so much for engaging in this conversation, Bill, and thank you, Martha, for your kind words. I'm delighted to be with everybody. Well, we're obviously not doing enough because the people of Ukraine are still suffering under the jackboot of Vladimir Putin and this fascist assault on Ukrainian democracy. So the position of President Biden and the administration has been that we should be doing everything within our power to fortify, arm, and strengthen Ukrainian resistance, short of our sending ground troops into battle in Ukraine. And so with that, we are preparing this evening to vote on a complete aid package of more than $13 billion to go into Ukraine. And we need to continue to use every conceivable form of diplomatic, economic, political, global cultural pressure on Putin to end this vicious assault on the Ukrainian people. And so there's a lot more that we can be doing, and we should use every international channel available to us, including the United Nations, the G20, NATO, whatever it is, to stop this barbaric and genocidal attack.
And Congressman, one thing that got lost that happened in Washington last week, understandably, because there was so much attention to the war in Ukraine, not a lot of attention to a brief that was filed in court by the January 6th Select Committee, of which you're a leading member, which said that you have evidence that the former president, Donald Trump, and his allies actually engaged in what you called a, quote, criminal conspiracy to prevent Congress from doing its job by certifying the last election. How significant is that filing?
Well, I don't think it's that significant in a factual sense, because after all, this is a former president who was twice impeached by the House of Representatives, and he was specifically impeached by the House on January 13th, 2021, for inciting a violent insurrection against the Union. And then there was a 57-43 vote in the Senate, finding by a bipartisan majority that Trump had actually engaged in this conduct. It's true that he beat the constitutional spread of 2/3 by 10 Republican votes that were missing, so he wasn't convicted. And yet we do have this emphatic bicameral bipartisan statement that he engaged in the conduct. But having said that, what's different here is that in this confrontation with John Eastman over his emails, where he's asserting attorney-client privilege, we have said, one, there was no attorney-client relationship formed. Two, if there was, it had been waived both by Trump and by Eastman in terms of everything that they were talking about at the time, and also by virtue of Eastman's use of his law school's email system. But finally, if all those things weren't true, if there really was an attorney-client relationship and it hadn't been waived, then none of it is protected by attorney-client privilege because of the so-called fraud crime exception, which is that the engagement in criminal and fraudulent activity by a client and his lawyer is not covered by the attorney-client relationship. And this whole effort, as we know, was clearly designed to defraud the American people, to overthrow Joe Biden's majority in the Electoral College. And more than 60 federal and state courts had rejected every claim brought forward by Donald Trump and by his followers of electoral fraud or corruption. Every state legislature they approached had rejected their entreaty to nullify the popular vote and just instate a Trump Electoral College ticket. And every election official they approached had rejected every overture they made just to find them 11,781 votes, as in the case of Georgia with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. So the point is, they knew that there was nothing to the claims making up this tissue of fraud contained in the big lie. They knew there was nothing to it, and yet they proceeded anyway. And so this was a fraud against the government, and it was an attempt to interrupt and to thwart an official governmental proceeding. And that included not just these efforts to trick everybody, but also it included the incitement of violence against Congress and against the vice president.
But it also was, you were saying, the committee is saying, a crime, part of a criminal conspiracy, correct? And if so, is that, Congressman, the first time to your knowledge, that a former president has been charged with a crime?
Well,
Right.
we haven't criminally charged him with a crime. I mean, this is a civil proceeding, and the judge, sua sponte, meaning of his own volition, raised the crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege. So we had an obligation to go ahead and brief it, to explain it, and to demonstrate that, if for no other reason, the activity they were engaged in was of a federal, fraudulent, and criminal nature, which it was. A conspiracy to obstruct a federal proceeding, a conspiracy to commit a fraud against the United States.
So then a lot of people are wondering what happens next. If can the committee charge the former president with committing a crime, or can the committee, and can we expect the committee to ask the Justice Department to investigate a possible crime on the part of the former president and file charges?
We have no power to charge. We have no power to charge him with a crime. Congress can't charge people with crimes. That's forbidden by the Constitution. Actually, it's called a bill of attainder. That's not the role of Congress. It's an executive branch function. We have the power to refer, the same power that any citizen would have to send information over to the Department of Justice in the event that we see evidence of criminal activity. I think all of this should be well known already to the Department of Justice. And it's part of our role, obviously, to make this kind of information public. But the role of our committee, Bill, under the HR 503, which the resolution that created us, is to determine the facts of what happened on January 6th, determine the causes behind these events, and then to make recommendations as to how to fortify democratic institutions against future insurrections and future coups, attempts to destabilize and overthrow our democracy. So that's our real function here. And I know there's a great hunger out there for individual criminal accountability. And all I can say about that is, that's a shared sense of frustration people have, but that really depends on what the Department of Justice is going to do and other actors within the prosecutorial field.
But do you believe the Department of Justice should investigate possible criminal activity on the part of the former president?
I believe the Department of Justice should investigate all criminal activity. Absolutely. I mean, and I believe they've already brought more than 700 charges related to January 6th. Everything from assaulting federal officers to destruction of federal property to trespass to seditious conspiracy in the case of some of the Oath Keepers and Proud Boys who, were told to stand back and stand by Donald Trump. So it seems to me that they're proceeding very much in the way that prosecutors do in a mob prosecution, a mob investigation. They work their way up and try to get the smaller fish to talk about the medium fish, to talk about the big fish. And so I think that they're proceeding in that fashion. I certainly hope they are, but again, that's not our principal function.
Understand. As a constitutional scholar, Congressman, the question, we know there's this policy at the Justice Department that a sitting president cannot be charged with a crime. Some say no matter what crime it is, even murder, he can charge a sitting president. Is there any protection for a former president, or is a former president subject to the law, could be charged with a crime?
Yes, it is absolutely the case. A former president can be charged with a crime. We don't have an office in the US Constitution of former president entitled to any kind of immunity, criminal immunity from prosecution, and so on. Forgive me, I've got to go vote. So you guys talk, and I'll be right back. Okay.
Great.
Martha, it is good to see our tax dollars at work.
Yes, exactly. So
And it's also good to know that Congress is doing something, right? I mean,
exactly. Yes.
I must say, it is rare in these days to have anything happen in Congress, which is, by the way, behind me, just 6 blocks behind me. You could, but if we went up to my bedroom, our bedroom, we could see the Capitol Dome from our, that's how close we are. So they're working tonight, which we hope is good news for the
It's
American.
good news. Yes. So while we're waiting for Congressman Raskin to come back, Bill, why don't you talk to us? I think one of the questions that a lot of us up here have is, why has Donald Trump's big lie that he actually won the 2020 presidential election, why has it taken hold with Republicans across the country, so many people across the country, and why has it basically taken hold of the Republican Party? How did this happen? Why did this happen?
I must say, it is stunning to think that this guy, who's basically a huckster from, I'm giving my point of view, of course, but I am a Democratic commentator, so I apologize if it seems too political, but it is amazing to me that this huckster, this real estate developer from New York, who had very little political experience and was not known necessarily as being a major intellect or philosopher or whatever, was able to take over the Republican Party in a very short period of time. I mean, he came down the escalator in July 2015, and within certainly within a year and a half, he'd totally taken over the Republican Party. People who had spent their entire lifetime defining what the Republican Party was all about, a party for smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation, and all that kind of stuff. And it's become basically a religious cult that the Republican Party today stands for nothing except Donald Trump. Donald Trump. I mean, remember, the Republican convention in 2016, National Convention, did not adopt a platform. They said, we don't need a platform. We're just for whatever Donald Trump wants, right? Now, how could that happen? I think, in response to your question, oh, he's back. Right.
Welcome back. That was quick.
That's probably the fastest vote in congressional history.
Well, I told them I had important business to attend to.
Thank you very much.
Well, welcome back. So let's go on to January 6th itself. And I mean, it's so both inspiring and chilling, your account of what happened and your experience of being in the Capitol when that violent assault happened on January 6th. Is it fair to call what happened a coup against the United States government?
Attempted coup.
Attempted
I mean,
coup.
the way I look at it, Bill, is there were 3 rings of seditious activity that took place on January 6th. The outer ring was made up of tens of thousands of people who came for a mass wild protest advertised by then President Trump. Some came with violent intentions, criminal intentions. Some came with innocent intentions. There was a spectrum of motivation represented in the crowd, but the crowd very quickly transformed into a mob riot, which ended up injuring and wounding and hospitalizing 150 officers who ended up with broken jaws, broken necks, broken arms, legs, traumatic brain injuries, post-traumatic stress syndrome, lost fingers, heart attacks, you name it. I mean, it was an absolute horror show, okay? That ring of the mob riot surrounded a middle ring of a couple of thousand people who were insurrectionists, violent insurrectionists made up of people from domestic violent extremist groups. So these were the Proud Boys who had been told to stand back and stand by, the Oath Keepers who've been charged with seditious conspiracy, which means conspiracy to overthrow the government, the 3 percenters, the militia groups, the QAnon networks that were very active, the Aryan Nations, the Unification Church, other assorted authoritarian right-wing political and religious cults, including a number of Christian white nationalist groups, okay? And so these were the people who acted as the frontline stormtrooper vanguard of the demonstration They smashed our windows. They broke down our doors. They began the violent assault against the officers, essentially destroying any inhibitions that the crowd had about becoming a mob. And then they stormed the Capitol, laid siege to the Capitol, and shut down the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in American history in order to allow Donald Trump to try to seize the presidency. And so the scariest ring of activity was the innermost ring, which was the ring of the coup. It's what the political scientists call a self-coup, where you have a sitting president who launches an attack on the constitutional order and normal constitutional process in order to seize the presidency against a popular mandate for arrival. And so that captures precisely what was taking place with Donald Trump. Coup is a strange word to use in American political parlance because we don't have a lot of experience with coups, and we think of a coup as something that takes place against a president, but this was a coup organized and orchestrated by the president against the vice president and against the Congress. Trump was not going to accept the outcome of the election under any circumstances unless he could somehow gerrymander his victory. And he was preparing his followers for many weeks before the election, saying that that the only way I could lose the election, he said, was if there is fraud. And so he repeated that propaganda for many, many weeks. The only way he could lose is if there was a fraud, a scam, it's stolen, and so on. And then on election night, he said we were on our way to winning. In fact, we did win the election. And then he refused to concede and then began this attack on the election. Some of it was lawful. The court suits, more than 60 of which rejected every claim he made of electoral fraud and corruption, including 8 federal judges that he had himself nominated to the bench. So that provides the most devastating, comprehensive record of the falsity of every allegation of his big lie. But then they began to pursue means of escalating illegitimacy, trying to get state legislatures to overturn the result, trying to get election officials like Brad Raffensperger to fabricate votes. That was Donald Trump not trying to stop election fraud. That was Donald Trump trying to commit election fraud and trying to get others to join his conspiracy. And when all of that failed, and when it failed to try to get the military or Homeland Security or the DOJ to seize the election machinery and to rerun the election, which of course there's no constitutional provision for that, but to get the military to rerun the election. When none of that worked, then everything came down to let's get Mike Pence to declare unilateral, categorical, and extra constitutional powers to reject electoral college votes coming in from Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, thereby lowering Biden's total from 306 in the electoral college to somewhere below 270. And the purpose of that was to trigger the provisions of the 12th Amendment, which says that if nobody gets a majority in the electoral college, the contest shifts immediately into the House of Representatives. And you ask, well, why would they want Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic House to be deciding? Under the 12th Amendment, we're not voting one member, one vote. We're voting one state, one vote. And they knew that after the 2020 elections, the GOP controlled 27 state delegations. We have 22 state delegations. Pennsylvania, 9-9, is split right down the middle, so it's off the field. Even had they lost my new best friend, the at-large representative from Wyoming, Liz Cheney, and she had defected, they still would have had 26 votes to declare Donald Trump the president, for him to seize the presidency for another 4 years. And at that point, he was prepared to follow the advice of his disgraced former national security advisor, Michael Flynn, who had been saying, invoke the Insurrection Act and declare martial law. So they would have run it like the Republican convention. They would have called it a victory for Trump. He would have said he was president, and he would have said, I'm going to send in the National Guard now, send in armed forces to put down the insurrectionary chaos he had unleashed against us, but then, pronounce himself a hero because he was able to put down all of the violence that Nancy Pelosi couldn't put down. And that's basically what they prepared to do. And it was only Mike Pence's refusal to go along with this plan that I think saved us from that attempted coup becoming a quasi-successful coup or turning into a civil war. Because, every time I talk to Jim Jordan, he goes, well, you're not going to deny 74 million people their voice. And I said, oh, you're going to deny 81 million people their voice and the majority that won in the popular vote and the electoral college. So, if they think that the winning side was going to lie down and let them roll all over us with these authoritarian banana Republican tactics, then they don't understand who they're dealing with.
And how would you assess, the committee has interviewed so many people and looking into, and Liz Cheney particularly has talked about this, the role of Donald Trump. Everybody, maybe not everybody, but many believe he inspired the insurrection on January 6th. Did he do more than that? Was he more than just the inspirer? Was he the organizer? Well,
he certainly inspired it, and he certainly incited it, and I think he was impeached for inciting it. But I think that there will be evidence that comes out at our hearings and in our report that he was instrumentally involved in the organizing and the coordination of those events. The demonstration could have taken place anywhere in America. Right. He had supported demonstrations taking place at the Michigan State Capitol in Lansing, for example, against Governor Whitmer, and he had done the same thing to others, but he chose the Capitol of the United States, and he chose it at 1 p.m. on January 6th, the constitutionally assigned date and time for Congress to be meeting in joint session to count the electoral college votes. And they chose as the theme of their March rally, Stop the Steal. And he repeatedly incited the crowd, saying that when there's fraud involved, you can operate according to completely different rules. You're going to have to fight and fight like hell, or you're not going to have a country anymore, and so on. Come on. How much common sense have we lost as a country if people don't see that as the president himself stage managing and choreographing an attack on our democracy?
And Congressman, again, through all the witnesses you've talked to and the research that the committee has done, a lot of people are trying to figure out what's behind the people who were part of this mob, what brought them to Washington. To what extent was racism a factor? Have you found? We see the echoes of Charlottesville and the white nationalists in Charlottesville, and see them on January 6th. Do you find that racism was motivating a lot of what we saw that day at the Capitol?
Well, I think that every citizen is going to have to try to figure that out for himself or herself. There's no doubt that there were rampant, overt expressions of racism, Confederate battle flags being brandished and being used to beat up Black and Hispanic cops. There were people in neo-Nazi regalia, people had T-shirts that said Camp Auschwitz on the front, staff on the back, or 6 million wasn't enough. So there's a lot of overt racism, and there's no doubt that from the standpoint of the insurrectionists, the domestic violent extremists, that racism was was an explicit part of the ideology of the day. Mm-hmm. I think that the deeper question that that the historians and sociologists and citizens are going to have to look into is to what extent the astonishing receptiveness of millions and millions of people to Donald Trump's utterly fraudulent claims in the big lie reflect profound racial anxiety and a sense of white supremacy lost. There was a real affinity between the political culture of that march and that mob riot and that insurrection and the whole lost cause romance of Reconstruction, the idea that, well, there was a white majority which really should have won the election, which has a presumption and an entitlement to rule in America, and it's somehow been displaced by a new America of young people and African Americans and Hispanic Americans and new immigrants and people from around the world. And so I write about in my book that, they may have been playing effectively to some profound, deeply seated anxieties and a sense of dispossession. And that might be kind of the underlying psychological tectonics of what took place. And none of that is to excuse it, of course. But I do think that Donald Trump was expert at manipulating those sentiments and those anxieties in the public.
And another thing you write about in the book, Congressman, particularly leading up to January 6th, which you thought was going to be, we all thought was going to be the normal congressional process of certifying the election. And you did a lot of homework, you and your colleagues, about what arguments the Republicans might bring to the floor that you would have to shoot down. And you were prepared for just about everything that might happen that day, except, and you and I have talked about this before, except for the violence. And so what we see as part of this Trump mob was that they not only came because they felt that their guy really had won the election, but they came intending for violence, and violence very much a part of the protest. And is that very much a part of the new right wing of America?
Well, you're right. But I should say that it wasn't that we didn't anticipate violence, because we did anticipate violence, but we anticipated violence that would remain outside. We knew that the Proud Boys and those groups were looking for Antifa, or people they called Antifa or Black Lives Matter, and they were roaming the streets of Washington, essentially spoiling for fights and just beating people up. But we had not prepared for a direct medieval style assault on the Capitol itself. And that's what I very much fault myself for, that we had spent all of this time preparing for every possible parliamentary route of attack on Biden's electoral college majority, including Pence stepping outside of his role. These were things we were prepared for, but we had not prepared for what would happen if the fascist street violence actually overtook the Capitol and merged with the attempted coup taking place on the inside. And that, of course, is a hallmark of fascism, when you have violent street thug movements that are in touch with and coordinated with inside political elites to try to achieve political objectives. As you know from my book, I condemn myself for not using the word suicide in our family, and not confronting the reality of suicide and talking about it, because I end up saying that not talking to young people who are struggling with depression about suicide is like not talking to high school students about sex. It's just stupid. You think you're being clever, but you think you're depriving that word or that concept of power, but you're not. You're endowing it with a lot more power by not invoking it, not mentioning it. And I think it's the same thing with the word fascism. I think there's a kind of political politeness or correctness which tells us we can't use the word fascism, and I don't accept it anymore. I mean, we saw an outburst of fascist politics from a lot of directions on January 6th, and it's still very much in the air. You can see it in people who violently disrupt school board meetings in order to attack public health protocols. You saw it on January 6th, and you see it in, just people showing up in Nazi regalia on top of highways and waving swastikas and so on. And so this is for real. They have unleashed a lot of the monsters and the demons of the 20th century, and they're back again. The fascism, the racism, the anti-Semitism, the authoritarianism.
Right. I mean, how concerned are you? How serious a problem do you believe it is that it seems that this combination of open racism, anti-Semitism, and violence are sort of the new form of dissent or protest accepted in this country?
Well, we see the price of it at the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. We see the price of it at the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, with the assault on Hispanic immigrants. We saw it at the Pulse nightclub in Florida. We see it at the attack on the Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, the AME church. And real people are dying because of this explosion of extremist violence and the rampant use of guns to terrorize people. So, I mean, there's nothing hypothetical about it. I mean, it's here, and people have died from it, and people are dying from it. And we saw what happened on January 6th, where these groups were able to celebrate the fact that they nearly knocked over the US government.
And Congressman, toward the end of the book, you talk about the fact that, in effect, the attempted coup did not end on January 6th. It continues today across the country, at the state level particularly, attempts to either suppress the vote or enable politicians who don't agree with the people's vote to overturn that vote.
The election, yeah.
How grave a threat is this to our democracy? And I mean, are our democratic institutions really in trouble?
We're in the fight of our lives to defend democratic institutions and democratic values, both all over the world, as we see in Ukraine, and Trump's buddy Vladimir Putin's fascist assault on the people of Ukraine. But we're in the fight of our lives right here. The Tocqueville said when he wrote Democracy in America that democracy in our country is always either shrinking and shriveling away, or it's growing and it's expanding. And we've been in very much of a contractionary mode with the voter suppression statutes, the use of the filibuster to shut down voting rights acts and protection of voting rights, right-wing judicial activism, the gerrymandering of our congressional districts, which the GOP defends with their lives. And we've done everything we can to try to get politicians out of the business of redistricting in the For the People Act, in the Freedom to Vote Act, but they won't have anything. They won't have anything with it. So there's great hope in the fact that we have commanding majorities of the American people on the side of democracy. I mean, Hillary beat him by 3 million votes, and Joe Biden beat him by 7.5 million votes. And the young people are coming our way, and the Americans are coming our way. And the GOP is a minority party, a shrinking minority party that has no agenda, literally no platform other than whatever Donald Trump says it is. And their whole agenda is really just voter suppression. And yet they have this bag of tricks against democracy, which they're able to use against us. And that's the struggle that we're in. And it's a pretty profound struggle. But it's been a nightmarish week for the people of Ukraine. But the democratic governments of the world and the democratic parties of the world, the democratic movements of the world have stood up against Putinism, which is also standing up against Trumpism. I mean, President Zelensky is a guy who stood up to the bullying of Donald Trump, remember, who insisted that Zelensky smear Joe Biden as the price for getting the military and economic and security assistance that had already been voted him by the US Congress. And he stood up against that. And now he's standing up against Trump's buddy, Vladimir Putin, the genius Putin.
Right. So Congressman, by the way, for all of our friends who are joining us tonight, it's just about time we want to leave some time for your questions as well. And I see many of you have already submitted questions in the Q&A icon there, which we'll get to in just a second. So if you haven't already submitted your questions, now's a good time. So Congressman, on a personal level, I must ask you, you talk in the book about the experience of being there with your family on January 6th, right on the heels of the terrible personal tragedy of losing your son, Tommy, toward the end of the last year. And then Nancy Pelosi turns to you and says, we're going to go ahead with this impeachment, the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, and we want you to be the lead manager. After everything you've been through, Congressman, one has to ask, where did you find the reservoir of strength and courage, given, again, the terrible loss in your family, to take on that challenge? And I must say, do such a magnificent job for the American people.
Well, I write in the book, Bill, as you know, that I think that Nancy Pelosi threw me a lifeline because I wasn't eating and I wasn't sleeping. And I was a wreck. I could not talk about Tommy or utter his name without dissolving completely into tears and anguish. And I didn't know whether I would really be able to do anything of meaning or substance again in my career, in my life. And she was sort of bringing me up and saying, we need you. And that was kind of the push that I needed to say I was going to do this in Tommy's honor, and I was going to have him in my heart the entire time, as I did. So, you know, I can't say much beyond that.
Well, what was so inspiring to me is that Tommy was kind of your guide through a lot of this, wasn't he? With his ideas and his passion and his belief in democracy and his values that really inspired you.
Yeah. I mean, I feel we're so far behind where Tommy was. He was like a messenger from a distant future that really is beyond the authoritarianism and the fascism and the war and the violence, you know, and we're still so much stuck with these problems that to me just feel like such a hangover from the last century. And I hope at the very least we can put them to bed now by standing strong for democracy and human rights for everybody. But you know, I don't, you know, I don't think that any of these conclusions are foreordained. I mean, we have to fight so hard, like the people of Ukraine are fighting. We've got to fight that hard for them and then for ourselves, and then to have the democratic governments of the world be able to actually govern and confront the nightmare of climate change and to deal with the crises of our time. I mean, if we're constantly dealing with the Proud Boys and the violence and the fascism and the corruption of the autocrats and the kleptocrats and the dictators, we are not going to be able to come close to doing the things we need to do to have our species survive. You know, so we need everybody engaged in this process to get through it. And it's not, I don't mean to guilt trip anybody, and I don't want people to feel like this is, you know, a terrible burden, because I think it's a great opportunity for us to bring people together, to transform some of the emotional and mental health crises that our people, especially our young people, have been suffering, and to get back on track. But we need the democratic movement to bring everybody in and to be filled with culture and music and comedy. And we've got to renew people's sense of hope. But the stakes are obviously deadly serious.
Congressman, thank you for being who you are. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you for writing this incredible book, Unthinkable. Are you ready for a couple of questions from our audience?
Yeah.
One for you, very practical. From Dean, when will the January 6th committee release its findings?
Well, it's a good question. I think we're targeted for hearings in May. I think that this has not been settled on yet, but I'm of the mind, speaking as one member, that a report doesn't have to be one thing. A report can be staged. I think about the Mueller report, which came out, all 500 or 600 pages of it, and nobody could digest it. It took 2 or 3 days, and that set us up, of course, for Bill Barr's lies about what was in the Mueller report. So I would prefer kind of a much more digestible release of our findings, and then maybe ultimately a generalized report where it's all together. And there's also nothing which says that a report has to be just typewritten letters. It could include video. It can include photographs. There can be other parts of it. I mean, we have a very dramatic and significant story to tell about right-wing authoritarianism in our century, and we have to use the media that are available to us to tell the story.
From Eleanor, if Trump is under criminal investigation, can he still run for president in 2024? Well,
yeah, just being under investigation doesn't stop anybody from running for anything. Let's see, had we succeeded in convicting him, not just impeaching him, but convicting him, then by majority vote, he could have been disqualified from holding federal office in the future, but that didn't happen. There's one other relevant constitutional provision, though, which is Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which says that anybody who has sworn an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution, but betrays the Constitution by engaging in armed rebellion or insurrection against the Union, may not hold office, federal or state office, again. And that was something that the radical Republicans had put into the Constitution during the Reconstruction period. And actually, it started as a far broader proposal, which is to say anybody who engages in insurrection or rebellion shall be disenfranchised forever. And that was the House proposal. And the Senate came back and said, no, let's limit it just to the most culpable people who'd actually sworn an oath of office before, betrayed the oath by engaging in insurrection or rebellion. And we're not even going to disenfranchise them. We're just going to say they can't hold office again. So it remains to be seen how exactly to activate Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. There is a mistaken theory out there among the right wing that this only applied to insurrection or rebellion in the Civil War. There's nothing in the 14th Amendment that cabins it in that way. And so, of course, it's directly at odds with the clear text of the amendment itself.
And Linda would like to know, do you think that what's happening in Ukraine right now could have an impact on how some of the right-wing citizens see the freedoms that we enjoy in this country, and they seem to want to take away those freedoms we're fighting for in Ukraine? At the same time, they're trying to take away some of those from our own citizens.
Well, yeah, it's a profoundly confusing and disorienting time for them because as recently as 2 weekends ago, one of their heroes, Nick Fuentes, who's a right-wing racist white nationalist, had an event, I think, with 800 or 900 people in Florida, where he asked for a round of applause for Russia, and they began chanting Putin. And then he remarked in an aside that, yes, they're criticizing Putin for being the new Hitler, as if that were a bad thing. So they've spent years conditioning people to love Putin and to praise Putin. And now it's confusing because the American people, of course, detest Putin and his authoritarianism. And so they're trying to ride that. Some of them, others are sticking with Putin, and Trump, of course, is just confused. And so I don't know ultimately what it does with them. There's no way that Donald Trump becomes a champion of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian democracy that he tried to prostitute and exploit and trample when he was president. I don't think there's any fundamental way he's going to abandon Vladimir Putin, who's the ringleader of the autocrats and the authoritarians around the world. And that's Trump's team, whether we're talking about the homicidal crown prince of Saudi Arabia, or Orban in Hungary, or El-Sisi in Egypt, or Duterte in the Philippines, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. That's Trump's team. That is the collection of states and crooks that Steve Bannon wants to organize into the white ethno states to attack democracy on earth.
So this gets right to maybe definitely gets to your job in the Congress. You and your fellow Democrats in the House. Felice would like to ask how a divided Democratic Party can take on the critical domestic issues facing the country while at the same time dealing with a pretty important foreign policy crisis, namely Ukraine. How do you manage both? And is the Democratic Party, I guess, equipped to take on both right now?
Well, it's happening right now. The President Biden has shown remarkable leadership in rallying the democratic peoples of the world, rallying NATO, and we've got tremendous unity. I think we've got unanimity within the Democratic caucus for all of the sanctions, for isolating Vladimir Putin, for turning him not just into a moral and political pariah and outlaw, which he's already done himself, but an economic and financial outlaw and pariah state. That's all through Democratic leadership. And we are the party of democracy here. So we've got no choice. So I think, we've shown overwhelming unity in terms of the $1.9 trillion infrastructure plan we did for the roads and the highways and the ports and the airports and the metro systems and universal broadband and cybersecurity and so on. And we are fighting for all of the elements of the Build Back Better program, universal pre-K for the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds, because it's such an essential time for neurological and intellectual development for kids, as well as reducing the prescription drug prices by giving the government the power to negotiate with Big Pharma in Medicare, the same power we've already got in Medicaid and the VA. So these are all things we're fighting for, and we've got great unity. And we're up against the filibuster, which is a huge problem for us. But there's kind of a rule that the historians have, which is that because the Democratic parties, the liberal parties, are much bigger coalitions, and because they are interested in people's freedom, that they're much messier, they're more disorganized. But when they get pushed to fight and democracy itself is on the line, then you're going to see a very tough, strong reaction. And the post-Trump Democratic Party is very different from the pre-Trump Democratic Party. I can assure you that.
When you add that up, do you think that is a strong enough message for Democrats in 2022 to hold on to the House and the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, our problem is not a message. Our problem is dealing with these anti-democratic mechanisms that I was talking about before, the gerrymandering of our congressional districts, the passage of voter suppression statutes, rolling back early voting, rolling back weekend voting, breaking up mail-in balloting, making it difficult in states for people to get an absentee ballot. Like you have to go out and get a notary public to sign that, you have certain valid reasons for doing that. And, all of these gimmicks and tricks that are put down to shift the locus of power to Republican legislatures or judges, and they're trying to overthrow bipartisan election boards in a lot of states. Like in Maryland, we've got Democrats and Republicans split all of the county boards and the state boards. Well, in Republican states, they're trying to get rid of that and say that they're all appointed by the governor or they're all appointed by the legislature. So you have one party making hundreds and hundreds of decisions about voting. And obviously in a totally tendentious way to try to gerrymander the outcome of the election. That's what we're up against. I mean, that's the real problem that we're facing in the election, not a question of messaging. I know people like to say, oh, wait, the Republicans are so great at messaging because fear and violence are such a clean message, whereas the Democrats, we're talking about childcare and we're talking about climate change and we're talking about democracy. Yeah, in other words, we're a real political party. We're talking about all that stuff. So let's stop blaming ourselves. What we're up against is authoritarian tactics on the right. That's the real issue that we're up against.
And Congressman, another issue that I know is very important to you, Gina raises this issue. She says, Congressman, you also have 2 daughters. So how do we fight the assault on women's rights today that we're seeing in places like Texas and Missouri?
Well, I mean, it's a great question because, the assault on constitutional democracy has a very important feature, which is the assault on the rights of women. And these rights have been hard won over the last half century for women to have equal decision making and equal authority in society, in the workplace, in the home, and so on. And they're ready to roll it back. And the Supreme Court that they've gerrymandered and that they've stolen through illegitimate tactics like denying my constituent Merrick Garland even a hearing when he was nominated for a Supreme Court justiceship by Barack Obama because they said it was too close to election and it was a year away. And then with Amy Coney Barrett, they actually have a hearing for her and a vote for her while voting is already taking place in some states, just a few months before. So, this is part of this fraudulent assault on democracy by a political party that now positions itself outside the constitutional order and is attacking the rights of the people. So, we're moving into, Handmaid's Tale type authority because we're going to have to try to get women in states like Mississippi or Texas the health care that they deserve, that they need. At the same time, that they'll start passing the equivalent of, fugitive slave law, saying, well, you can't help a woman leave the state for the purposes of procuring an abortion. Like the law they've got in Texas now, which allows anybody anywhere, including, convicted racist murderers, to sue people who help women exercise their rights under the Constitution. So, I mean, it's a scandalous, terrifying situation, but let's go out and tell the people what they're doing. The other problem, of course, is that people are a lot of people are trying to get away from red states. And that's a problem because, I spoke the other day to some students at George Washington and University, and they feel desperate about where things are. And they said, well, what can we do? And I said, well, I'll give you the advice I give to the little kids in soccer, which is don't bunch. Not everybody should be living in Brooklyn or DuPont Circle. Spread out around the country. Go back to where you're from. We need people in Alabama, and we need people in Texas and Alaska and North Dakota and North Carolina and so on. So that's going to be important. I mean, people should not be huddling together for ideological warmth just in the blue jurisdictions.
You make me feel so guilty because I'm not thinking about moving to Alabama.
Well, you can help some other people who are already there, and don't give up on any part of the country. And it's very important to be supporting the Democratic parties in those counties and towns and cities around the country. I mean, it's just like hand-to-hand combat to defend reasonable policies on school boards right now. And there's a big movement of book banning and book burning that's going on in the country.
Yeah, Martha, if I could ask just one closing question, I think, to the Congressman.
That would be great. Good.
Which is, Congressman, how do you, in the end, I mean, we see so many things. We've talked about the assault on our democracy on the part of the former president and his followers, some Republican members of Congress in state after state legislatures trying to suppress the vote or give people the chance. Our democracy is really under attack. Are you optimistic that our democracy will survive?
Well, I'm totally optimistic, not because it's predestined or necessary. I don't believe in that kind of American exceptionalism anymore. I saw what fascism looks like on January the 6th, 2021. And that's as close as I ever want to come to it again, or I want my family to come to it, or I want my country to come to it. But what makes us exceptional is not that somehow it can't happen here. What makes us exceptional is that we began as a slave republic of white male property owners over the age of 21, but successive generations of Americans have fought for the ideals that Thomas Jefferson wrote down in the Declaration of Independence. With all of his personal flaws and his own fateful compromise with slavery, he wrote down the language of the consent of the governed and all men being created equal, and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and unalienable rights, and so on. Those concepts have been fought for, and you can look at the 17 amendments we've had since the Bill of Rights overwhelmingly as a chronicle of the movements to concretize political equality and freedom in the country and to make us a more perfect union. So it's the determination of the people to fight that makes us exceptional, and that we've been able to bring in people from all over the world as an asylum for mankind, Tom Paine said, an asylum for humanity, not an insane asylum, but an asylum for people fleeing from religious and political and economic persecution from all over the world to come here to find freedom. And we still have that spirit, and the people have it, but we're dealing with some rickety and antique political institutions that have been gerrymandered in such a way as to choke off the will of the majority. So we've got to fight real hard to see that the majority will is effectuated and implemented, and we got to fight real hard to see that democracy gets back on the growth path. And that means statehood for people who live in Washington, D.C., 713,000 disenfranchised tax-paying American citizens. It means statehood for people in Puerto Rico, 3.5 million American citizens who've seen recently the bitter price of colonial status when they were cheated out of hundreds of millions of dollars in aid during Hurricane Maria. Instead, Donald Trump, threw them some paper towels. We need to get back on the growth path in terms of protecting everybody's right to vote and participate. And we eventually are going to have to deal with the problems of the Electoral College, which now has become not just a threat to majoritarianism, but an active threat to the security of our system, because every nook and cranny and phase in the Electoral College process has been converted into a forum for partisan conflict and now political violence.
All right. Thank you, Congressman. You lead and we will follow. We'll fight right alongside of you.
Martha.
Thank you
Bill
both
Press.
so much.
Thank you,
And
Martha.
thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Bill. This was wonderful. Buy Jamie's book. There's signed copies at Oblong. And thank you so much for your generous time, Congressman Raskin. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Okay. Good night, everybody. Thanks.